You're about to learn how to use Ableton Live's Vocoder to add texture to your sounds. Here's an example. Listen for the differences on the kick, snare, and synthesizer. Hey, I'm Thales, pop music producer, and this tutorial is not going to encompass all the features the vocoder device has, like making vocals sound like a synthesizer. Instead, we're going to focus on the easiest, most obvious way to enhance drum samples, synthesizers, and even basses that's often overlooked, which is adding a layer of noise that follows the same envelope as the source audio and tracks its pitch. That makes the vocoder device very special. And that works so well because noise is soothing. It's made of a bunch of neighboring frequencies, so if you layer noise on top of a sound, it never sounds auto-tuned, and it even helps smoothen harsh sounds. That's why if you're playing a high-pitched synthesizer, you can almost always make it sound better by using the noise oscillator that's in your synth. Here's an example without the noise layer from the vocoder effect, then adding the noise. And here's the vocoder in isolation. Did you notice how much texture was added to that initially boring sound? That's also why layering noise is my #1 shortcut for thickening drums and percussion samples. For example, I was synthesizing some tom drums with Serum and I felt like they were hollow. They weren't hitting hard enough. There was a gap in the mid-range that was keeping them from being punchy. Watch what happens when I turn the vocoder layer on. The vocoder adds so much body to the final product, right? Here's just the vocoder. I've also done the same thing with snares. Now just the texture layers. And it's awesome to add top end to dull sound samples like some kick drums. It helps them cut through the mix, like this one. Now just the top. You can also use a vocoder to smoothen out harsh cymbals or hi-hats. Now that you have some ideas of when to use the vocoder for layering noise, here's how to use the controls in your vocoder. But first, subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying this video. Alright, first of all, for the uses I've shown you in this video, we're always going to have noise as the carrier. The other modes are also really cool, but for different reasons we're not covering today. Once you load the vocoder on the track you want to add texture, you can either use the dry and wet knob to mix it with the original sound, or use the audio effect rack so you have two parallel chains. One has no effects and the other has the vocoder. This is my favorite way, so I keep the dry wet knob at 100% and blend the effect using the chain volume. If you want your texture to be placed in the center of the stereo field, select mono on the top right. If you want the texture to be wide, select either stereo or LR mode. Stereo if the original sound is a mono signal, and LR if the original sound is a stereo signal. Now, do you want to add noise to specific narrow frequency bands or to the whole frequency spectrum? You can use this panel in the center to determine that. First, I like to pick the number of bands that the vocoder will split the signal into, and more bands mean more defined sound. Less bands mean more blurry or robotic. Both ways are awesome, it just depends on how you want it to sound. And these yellow bars, to put it simply, they're like an internal equalizer. So you have the low end on the left side and the high frequencies on the right side. You can use this pencil icon to cut or boost specific bands from the effect signal. The more bands you have, the more surgical you can get with this effect. And you can expand the range of the effect from as low as 20 Hz to as high as 18 kHz. Or you can narrow it down to a smaller range if that's what you need. Now this BW stands for bandwidth, and it controls how wide or narrow each one of these EQ bands are. So if you set this at less than 100%, there are going to be gaps between one band and another. If you set this at a higher value than 100%, these bands will start overlapping. It's better if I show you. Here's what the spectrum looks like at 100% when I play a synth going through the vocoder. It looks just like noise, right? Now this is what happens when I lower the bandwidth to 10%. Feel free to experiment with this to see what kinds of effects you can come up with, but I seem to always like how it sounds when I leave it alone at 100%. And I love that you can totally shape the envelope of the texture. This depth knob makes sure that the vocoder effect follows the attack, sustain, decay, and release of the original signal. If you lower it, it starts ignoring the original envelope. At 0%, it sounds like the effect is at full sustain, completely independent from the source. At 200%, only the loudest peaks will trigger the vocoder. For this kind of layering, I like to keep this around 100%, maybe a little less for sustained instruments and a little more for percussive sounds. But the vocoder also has attack and release controls to fine-tune the effect's duration. When I want this effect to feel as tight as possible, almost transparent, and blend in with the original signal, I keep the depth at 100% and the attack and release at very low amounts. If you increase the attack, it takes longer for the vocoder to trigger. It softens the initial transient. If you increase the release, the vocoder effect will last longer than the original signal, therefore the tail becomes more noticeable, almost like a reverb. In fact, you can use this to create a fake reverb, for example on a snare sample. Next, there's this gate control that's super useful if you only want to apply the vocoder to the loudest signals and bypass the quieter sounds like reverb tails from the original audio. The more you increase this, the more you emphasize transients, almost isolating transients. For example, listen to this vocoder transient layer on my snare track. It's getting rid of the decay and keeping only the attack. So this can be used like a transient designer effect, but in a layering fashion. In fact, I'm starting to use this more and more often in the occasions where I would normally use a transient designer plugin because of the amount of bands it lets me control. I can actually split the frequency spectrum in up to 40 bands and pick the ranges where I want to reinforce my transients, and that's crazy good. Here's another cool thing. This format knob allows you to shift the pitch center of your texture up and down. It's kind of like tuning the noise. Now that you understand how this effect works, it makes sense to show you the Enhance button. The info view says that it normalizes all the frequency bands and that results in a brighter sound. But I've tested it many times and that's not always true. The sound does get more balanced most times, so make sure to listen in your scenario and compare it and figure out which one you prefer. And there's this unvoiced knob that emphasizes the percussiveness in your sound source. Sensitivity is like the threshold for this percussive effect. For example, if you use this on a vocal, it makes the consonants more pronounced, therefore it gets more intelligible. I'm using this feature on my toms to increase the knock, that initial hit. This XY pad changes the character of the noise. If you drag it to the left, it decreases the sample rate. If you drag it to the bottom, it decreases the density of the noise. This can sound really good on percussive sounds. I have it all the way at the bottom for my tom drums. There's another plugin I like to mention that does a similar job, and it has many different kinds of noise textures, from frying eggs to water sounds. It's the NoiseShaper that runs inside ShaperBox by Cable Guys. I just recently started using it, so I need to spend more time with it before I can review it. But if you want to go ahead and check it out, the link to their website is in the description below this video. I know it's awesome because these are the same guys that made Volume Shaper, which I just reviewed last week. It's my favorite tool to create sidechain and pumping effects. If you like that kind of effect too, here's the video, go watch it.